My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 62 years old, and I have spent most of my life learning when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. If you'd met me 30 years ago, you'd have thought I was the quiet type by nature. You might have said I had a calm presence, or that I was easy to be around. People used those words like they were compliments, and I let them. I even smiled when they said I was lucky to have a husband like Thomas, a man who was steady, polite, and, as everyone loved to point out, never the sort to cause a scene. But that's the thing. Thomas didn't have to cause a scene to make sure I stayed in my place. He feared my voice. That's why he spent decades finding ways to take it from me without ever touching me. It didn't happen all at once. At the start, it felt like love. He listened to me, or at least he made me believe he did. He'd say things like, "I just worry about you, Maggie," or "I want to protect you from the stress of certain things." And at 24, fresh out of teacher's college, I thought that kind of attention meant I was cherished. But protection turned into restriction. Concern became correction. And slowly, without me even noticing, my words, my opinions, my laughter, my dreams started shrinking to fit the space he allowed. It was little things first. At dinner with friends, if I told a story, he'd interrupt to clarify a detail. If I disagreed with him on something, politics, money, even what movie to watch, he'd smile, lean in, and whisper, "Don't make a fuss in front of people." When I got promoted to head of the English department at my school, he congratulated me at home, but at a party a week later, he told someone, "It's just a title, really. Doesn't mean she has to work harder," like he needed to shrink it down before it could grow inside me. None of these moments were enough on their own to point to and say, "Here, this is abuse." But they were bricks, one after another, building a wall between me and my own voice. We had one child, a son, Daniel. He was my joy, my proof that I could still nurture something in a home where I was slowly withering. But even my relationship with him wasn't fully mine. Thomas believed father should be the final word in a household. So my suggestions were often met with, "Let's see what Dad thinks," even when it was about something as small as whether Daniel could have a friend sleep over. By the time Daniel left for college, the house had gone silent in a way that was suffocating. My days were routine. Wake early, teach, come home, cook, clean, sit across from a man who spoke more to the television than to me. I told myself it was fine. After all, he never shouted. He never called me names. And the world seems to think that's the line, that unless there's shouting or bruises, it can't be all that bad. But the truth was, the silence in our house was not peace. It was control. It was the kind of quiet that leaves no room for your own thoughts unless you hide them deep. I learned to live in my head. I wrote lesson plans late at night just for the comfort of putting something on paper that Thomas couldn't edit. I read novels and imagined myself as the women who traveled to Italy alone, or who started over in small coastal towns, or who left husbands who never did them any harm except stealing the best years of their lives. The first real crack came when my father died. It was a gray morning in March when my sister called. I remember my knees giving out before the phone call ended, the sound of my own sob catching in my throat. I told Thomas through tears, "I need to go to Boston. The funeral's on Saturday." He didn't even look up from the paper. "That's a long drive for just a couple of days. Maybe send flowers instead." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. "He was my father," I said. Thomas sighed, like I was being unreasonable. "You're upset now, but think about the expense, the time off work." I didn't let him finish. "I'm going," I said, my voice louder than I'd heard it in years. He blinked at me, truly blinked, as if the idea of me deciding something without his approval was too strange to compute. But I went. The drive to Boston was 7 hours, and I spent them in a kind of stunned silence, not because of grief alone, but because of what that small act of defiance had done to me. I had spoken, and I had not asked. At the funeral, surrounded by family who spoke to me as if I mattered, I realized how much of myself I had buried. My sister, Eleanor, hugged me and said, "You sound different on the phone lately, quieter, not in a good way." I brushed it off, but her words lodged in me. When I got back home, Thomas didn't ask how it was. He just said, "I hope you got it out of your system." I didn't answer, but in my head, something shifted. I began keeping a notebook in my desk drawer at school, a place he would never think to look. In it, I wrote everything I didn't say out loud. I wrote about the way he corrected me in public, how he never once asked about my day without following it with advice on how I should have handled it differently, how the air in our house felt heavier when he was home. And I started writing questions. When did I stop telling jokes at dinner? When did my voice start sounding like an apology? When did Thomas stop fearing the world and start fearing me speaking the truth about it? I didn't know then that the answers were already coming. They would come in small, quiet moments, moments that would grow into something too big for Thomas to silence. The notebook became my lifeline. At first, I only wrote in it once or twice a week, small entries I could justify to myself as just sorting through my thoughts. But soon, it became a daily ritual. Before first period, while the hallways were still echoing with the clatter of lockers, I'd sit at my desk and put down everything I couldn't say at home. It wasn't just complaints. I wrote memories. I wrote questions. I wrote versions of conversations that had never happened but should have. I wrote the Margaret I remembered being before Thomas's voice became louder than my own in my head. The more I wrote, the more I noticed just how much space his presence took up, not only in the house, but in my mind. I'd be driving home from work and find myself rehearsing what to say if he asked why I was late. I'd stand in the grocery store debating whether to buy the cereal I liked because he'd once called it a waste of money. This is the part that people don't understand about control. You start policing yourself before they even have to. They've trained you that well. One Wednesday afternoon, I stopped at the corner cafe near the school. There was a chalkboard outside that read, "Poetry reading tonight, 7 p.m. I stood there for a good minute, staring at it, feeling that old longing to be somewhere that words were free. By the time I got home, Thomas was already in his chair, TV on. I told him about the reading, not asking permission, just saying it like a fact. He didn't even look away from the screen. Poetry? Since when are you into that? Since always, I said. There was a pause. I thought you'd make dinner tonight. The old me, the one who wanted peace more than anything, would have offered to cook early or promised to bring him something back. But that day, I simply said, "You can make a sandwich," and went to change my clothes. The reading was held in the back room of the cafe, where mismatched lamps cast warm light over an audience of maybe 20 people. The poets were just locals, most of them reading from crumpled pages, their voices shaky at first. But there was something electric in the air, the kind of energy that comes from people saying exactly what they mean without fear. One woman read a poem about leaving her husband after 30 years. She spoke of silence as if it were a living thing, a shadow in every corner of her home. I felt my chest tighten with recognition. Afterward, I didn't go straight home. I sat in my car with the engine off, writing by the dim light of the street lamp. My handwriting was messier than usual, but the words came out fast. Silence is not peace. Silence is the sound of your own voice fading until you can't remember what it sounded like. I went inside that night and found Thomas in bed, asleep. I brushed my teeth in the dark, my mind still buzzing with the rhythm of other people's words. And for the first time in years, I fell asleep without feeling that heavy knot in my stomach. From then on, I started going to more events, not just poetry readings, but the monthly book club at the library, a lecture series at the community center. Thomas noticed. "You've been out a lot lately," he said one evening, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "I like being out," I replied. He chuckled. "You never used to." That was the thing. I had, once, before him, before my schedule was built entirely around his needs, before the version of me that went to museums alone or took road trips on a whim had been told little by little to sit down and be still. I didn't say any of that. I just smiled. And he didn't press. Not then. But I could feel the shift between us, even if he couldn't name it. A week later, it happened. The moment that told me Thomas wasn't just dismissive of my voice. He was afraid of it. I was grading essays at the kitchen table when the phone rang. It was a reporter from the local paper, a former student who'd gone into journalism. She was writing a piece on the state of public education and wanted to include quotes from teachers who'd been in the field for decades. I agreed. The interview took place over the phone that Saturday morning. I spoke openly about budget cuts, about how much harder it had become to teach when the administration cared more about test scores than about real learning. I didn't hold back. I even criticized certain policies by name. What I didn't know was that Thomas was standing just inside the doorway to the hall, listening. When I hung up, he stepped forward. "What was that?" "An interview," I said. "You can't talk like that. Not with your name in print. People will think you're, what, opinionated, informed?" "Difficult," he said flatly. I laughed, a short, sharp sound. If telling the truth makes me difficult, then maybe I am. His jaw tightened. You don't want to make trouble for yourself. And there it was, that familiar note in his voice. Not concern for me, but fear of me drawing attention, fear of me being visible, being heard, being believed. It hit me then. This wasn't about dinner or poetry or schedules. It was about control of the narrative. If I spoke, I might tell a version of our life that didn't match the one he'd carefully constructed for others. The next week, the article was published. My quotes were bold, unapologetic, printed in black and white for the whole town to see. Thomas didn't say a word about it. But he started closing the door when he took calls. He started asking where I was going in a way that felt like an audit, not a question. And me? I started thinking about what Carol, one of the book club women, had told me after a meeting. When they fear your voice, they'll try to convince you it's safer to be quiet. That's when you know you're saying something worth hearing. Those words stayed with me, running under everything like a low hum. And I realized maybe the first step toward getting my life back wasn't leaving right away. Maybe it was speaking until he couldn't silence me anymore. The first time I spoke back to Thomas in public, it wasn't planned. We were at a retirement dinner for one of his colleagues, the kind of event where the tablecloths are too white, the wine glasses too thin, and the conversations too careful. I had been to dozens of these over the years, always playing my part, nodding in the right places, smiling just enough, speaking only when directly addressed. Halfway through the meal, one of the wives asked me about the article in the paper. She said she admired the courage it took to speak so honestly about the school system. Her eyes were warm, genuine, and for a moment I felt like myself, the version who wasn't filtered through Thomas's approval. I thanked her, and we began talking about the shortage of teachers in rural districts. Thomas cut in. Margaret's always had strong feelings about these things, sometimes a little too strong. It was meant as a joke, delivered with that easy grin of his. The table chuckled politely, but something in me snapped. I turned to him and said, "Strong feelings are what keep people from sitting quietly while everything falls apart. I'd rather have them than sit on my hands." The table went still. You could almost hear the sound of forks pausing over plates. Thomas's smile faltered just slightly, but enough for me to see it. For the rest of the evening, his tone toward me was tight, precise, like he was reeling the line back in. He refilled my water glass without asking. He corrected the way I pronounced the name of a wine. He told the story of our first date in a way that left me invisible, like the only notable part was how lucky I was that he'd asked me out. I didn't say anything else, not because I'd been silenced, but because I knew the power of letting a moment breathe. That one comment, that single refusal to play along, had already shifted something. When we got home, he shut the door with more force than necessary. "What was that?" "What was what?" I asked, hanging my coat. "You know what?" Correcting me in front of people like that. I met his eyes. I wasn't correcting you. I was speaking. His jaw worked, the muscle twitching. You made me look foolish. No, I said evenly. You did that yourself when you tried to make me small. He didn't answer. He just walked past me into the kitchen, muttering something about how I'd been different lately. That night, I sat in bed with my notebook, writing until my hand ached. I wrote about the look on his face, about the stunned silence at the table, about how my voice hadn't shaken once. I wrote about how, for the first time in decades, I'd felt like my words had weight in the room, and how that weight was mine alone to carry. The next week, I noticed changes. Subtle, but there. He began calling me at work more often. Just to check in, he said. He started volunteering to drive me to evening events, lingering nearby instead of going home. It wasn't concern. It was surveillance disguised as care. One Wednesday, after book club, he was waiting in the parking lot. I hadn't told him when the meeting ended, but there he was, leaning against the car, smiling that smile he used when he wanted people to believe we were the perfect couple. How was it? He asked as I got in. Good, I said, buckling my seatbelt. He glanced at me. You know, I've been thinking. Maybe I should come with you sometime. It's for members, I replied. I could join. The idea of him sitting in that room, the one place I felt unobserved, sent a chill through me. It's not really your thing, I said. He didn't push it, but his silence on the drive home was the kind that used to make me rush to fill it. I didn't this time. Instead, I started thinking about the difference between speaking and being heard. I could use my voice at home all I wanted, but with him, it was like shouting into a pillow. It took speaking in front of others to make it real, to make him feel it. So I started doing it more. At the next department meeting at school, I challenged a budget decision that everyone else had quietly accepted. At the following book club, I read one of my own short essays aloud, something I hadn't dared do since my 20s. The women clapped. Carol smiled at me in that knowing way, like she could see the outline of my plan before I'd even admitted it to myself. One night after the meeting, Carol walked me to my car. You're getting ready, she said. For what? I asked, though I knew. To leave. I opened my mouth to deny it, but nothing came out, because it was true. Even if I didn't have a date set, even if I hadn't figured out the logistics yet, I was already halfway gone in my mind. The hardest part, I realized, wouldn't be the leaving. It would be the day he finally understood that he couldn't stop me with silence anymore. That moment would come, and when it did, I wanted to be ready. So I began collecting the pieces of my exit quietly. I opened a bank account under my own name. I started keeping certain mail at school. I saved cash in an envelope tucked into an old dictionary that hadn't been opened in years. I didn't tell a soul except Carol, not even Eleanor, not yet. And all the while, I kept speaking in public. I kept building the muscles of my voice until I could feel them, strong, steady, unshakable. Because I knew the day would come when Thomas would try one last time to shut me down. And this time, I wouldn't just push back. I'd walk right past him. It happened in early October on a Saturday night at the Harvest Festival. In our town, the festival is the one event of the year where nearly everyone turns up. There are stalls with pumpkin pies, quilts, and handmade candles. A band plays in the square. People you haven't seen in months show up with casseroles and folding chairs. For years, Thomas and I had attended together, walking arm in arm, so people could see how solid we were. I'd let him do most of the talking, smiling in the background like a polite prop. But this year felt different. I had been invited to speak at the community stage, not about my marriage, but about literacy programs I'd been helping to launch at the library. It was only supposed to be a 10-minute talk, but it meant something to me. It was proof that my voice had a place outside our home, outside him. When I told Thomas, he'd nodded slowly. "You'll be nervous. You're not used to speaking to crowds." "I teach classrooms full of teenagers every day," I reminded him. "That's different," he said, and the faintest smile tugged at his lips. "You'll want to rehearse." "I've already written my speech," I said. His smile faltered. The day of the festival was bright and brisk. I wore a scarf Eleanor had given me years ago, one Thomas always said was too loud. I arrived early to help set up, moving folding chairs into neat rows. Thomas showed up 15 minutes before my slot, his hands in his pockets, surveying the space like it was his to approve. When it was my turn, I stepped up onto the stage. The crowd wasn't huge, maybe 50 people, but it was enough. Enough to make me feel the small tremor of nerves in my legs, and enough to remind me that speaking here meant speaking where Thomas could hear every word. I began simply, talking about the children who came to the library after school, the joy of watching them discover books that felt like friends. I spoke about the fundraising we'd done, the volunteers who'd given their time, the difference it was already making. I was halfway through when it happened. From somewhere in the crowd, I heard Thomas's voice, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "She always makes it sound bigger than it is," he said with a laugh. "It's just reading time at the library." A few people glanced his way, unsure if they should laugh with him or pretend they hadn't heard. My heart gave a sharp, painful thud, the old instinct to shrink, to swallow my words, to keep the peace. But then I looked at the children in the front row, at the faces of the volunteers sitting together in the middle, and I thought, this is mine. I smiled at the crowd. For some people, I said, my voice steady, teaching a child to read is small. But for that child, it can be the moment the whole world opens. And if you've never had to fight for your voice, you might not understand what it means to finally have one. The words hung there. The silence that followed wasn't the suffocating kind. It was the listening kind. Heads turned toward Thomas. He shifted in his seat, but he didn't speak again. I finished my talk, thanked the crowd, and stepped down into a cluster of handshakes and kind words. Someone slipped a folded 20 into the donation jar. A young mother told me Her daughter had joined the program because she'd heard me talk about it at the school fair. Thomas walked beside me after that, but he didn't touch me. His face was tight, his jaw set. "You embarrassed me," he said, once we were out of earshot. "No," I said, "I told the truth. If that embarrassed you, that's not my problem." He didn't reply. And for the rest of the evening, he didn't introduce me to anyone we met. It was as if I'd vanished from his narrative entirely. But the truth was, I had just become more visible than I'd been in years. People began stopping me at the grocery store to ask about the program. I was invited to speak at a regional conference on literacy. My name started appearing in the paper without his attached to it. And I could see it, the way his eyes narrowed when I took a call, the way his hand tightened on his glass when someone mentioned my work. He wasn't just annoyed. He was afraid. Because once people heard my voice, he couldn't control what they thought of me. He couldn't make me small again without them noticing. At home, his strategies shifted. There were more backhanded compliments, more reminders of all he'd done for me, more subtle digs about how ungrateful I was becoming. One night over dinner, he said, "You've been awfully busy lately. Don't forget where your real priorities are." I set down my fork. My priorities haven't changed. I've just stopped pretending they begin and end with you. He stared at me for a long moment, then gave a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Careful, Margaret." I didn't answer. But later, in bed, I thought about how careful used to make me retreat. Now, it only made me more certain, because if he feared my voice, it meant I still had it, and I wasn't about to give it back. By November, the house felt different. Not to look at. The furniture was still in the same places, the curtains still drawn the way Thomas liked, the air still faintly carrying the scent of his aftershave. But beneath that sameness, there was a charge I could feel in my bones. It was like living in a room where someone has hidden a live wire. Nothing you can see, but you know it's there, humming, waiting to spark. After the Harvest Festival, something in Thomas's manner shifted. He spoke less in public when I was present, as if to avoid giving me openings. At home, he became more strategic. He'd suddenly remember important conversations to have with me right before I was due to leave for book club or the library. He began misplacing my car keys or mentioning at the last minute that he needed me to pick something up across town, errands that would run late enough to interfere with whatever I'd planned. It was never blatant, always just subtle enough to pass for coincidence. But I recognized it for what it was. He was tightening the net. One Tuesday evening, I was supposed to meet Carol and 2 other women from the literacy program to discuss a grant proposal. I had my bag ready by the door when Thomas walked in, holding a stack of papers. "These need to be signed tonight," he said, setting them on the counter. "It's the renewal for the insurance on the house." I glanced at the clock. "Can it wait until morning?" "No," he said, with that clipped tone he reserved for moments when he wanted to end a discussion before it began. "If it doesn't go out in tomorrow's mail, the policy lapses. Something about the timing was too perfect. "Why didn't you bring this up before now?" He shrugged. "I only found it in the pile this afternoon. You know how much mail we get." It was a lie. Thomas never lost track of paperwork. But I didn't have the luxury of calling him out. I signed quickly, knowing full well he'd won this round. By the time I got to the library, the meeting was over. When I told Carol what had happened, she just shook her head. "He's starting to feel the ground shift. They always tighten their grip right before they lose it completely." That thought stayed with me, not as a warning, but as a strange kind of comfort. 2 weeks later, we had the first snow of the season. I was grading papers at the kitchen table when Thomas came in, stamping the cold from his boots. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about retirement." This wasn't a surprise. He'd been hinting at it for a while, but there was something in his tone that made me look up. "I thought I'd do it sooner rather than later," he went on. "That way I can be home more, keep you company." The way he said it made my skin prickle. Not a suggestion, not a hope, a statement of fact. "Retirement's a big decision," I said carefully. He smiled faintly. "So is deciding how much time we spend apart." I didn't respond, but my mind was already moving. If he was home all day, my small pockets of freedom, the quiet hours after work, the mornings on weekends, would vanish. The window I'd been prying open for months would slam shut. That night, lying in bed beside him, I knew I had to choose. If I stayed much longer, I'd lose the progress I'd made. And if I waited for the perfect moment to leave, it might never come. The next day, I started packing in secret. Not into suitcases, that would be too obvious, but into plain cardboard boxes I kept at school under the pretense of donations for a classroom project. A coat here, a stack of books there. Little by little, my life began moving elsewhere. Carol helped me find a small apartment 2 towns over, an upstairs unit above a bakery, with creaky floors and windows that let in too much light. I signed the lease under my own name. The day I slid the key into my coat pocket, I felt a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying start to shift. But Thomas wasn't finished. It was the second week of December when he finally made his move. We were invited to a holiday gathering at the home of one of his old colleagues. I hadn't planned to go. I had promised to attend the library's winter fundraiser, but Thomas insisted. "It's important," he said. "People will notice if you're not there." I knew better than to argue in front of anyone else, so I went. Halfway through the evening, while I was speaking to the host about the literacy program, Thomas slid into the conversation. "Oh, Margaret's been spending a lot of time on that little project," he said. "It keeps her busy, bless her heart." The little project, the bless her heart. It was all there. The deliberate belittling, wrapped in a smile, meant to keep the room comfortable. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. This was it. The moment. I turned to the host. "It's not a little project. We've doubled enrollment in 3 months. We've secured funding from the state for next year, and in January I'll be speaking at the regional conference in Albany about expanding the program." The host beamed. "That's wonderful, Margaret." And just like at the Harvest Festival, the room shifted. People looked at me, not him, Thomas's hand tightened around his glass. He smiled thinly, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, the same one I'd seen the first time I'd refused to apologize. I knew then that there was no going back. When we got home, he didn't speak to me, not that night, not the next morning. His silence wasn't the heavy, oppressive kind anymore. It was hollow, a silence that said he could feel control slipping and didn't know how to get it back. 3 days later, I moved the last of my boxes to the apartment. I didn't tell him yet, not because I was hesitating, but because I wanted the timing to be mine. I'd already chosen the day, and it was coming fast. The day I left came sooner than I expected. It was a Thursday morning in mid-December. The sky was the pale, washed-out gray that always comes before snow. I'd planned to wait until Saturday to have one last quiet night to myself at the apartment before telling him. But that morning, something happened that made waiting impossible. I was in the kitchen pouring coffee when Thomas came in. He didn't say good morning. He just set a stack of envelopes on the counter in front of me. "These came yesterday," he said. "You've been getting mail at the school." My chest tightened. I hadn't been careless. I'd had my bank statements, lease paperwork, and grant documents sent to the school office specifically so he wouldn't see them. But somehow he'd found out. "They forwarded it to the house," he said, his voice casual, too casual. "Strange, isn't it? All these things in your name." I didn't answer. I just sipped my coffee, letting the warmth steady my hands. "I think," he said slowly, "we should start being more transparent with each other. No more secrets." For years, those words would have been the beginning of an argument I couldn't win, or the end of a day spent bending myself into whatever shape he needed. But now, all I felt was stillness. I set my cup down. "You're right," I said. "No more secrets." I walked past him, into the bedroom, and pulled the suitcase from the closet. Not the boxes at school, not the hidden things, just what I needed for today. My coat, my scarf, my notebooks, the tea tin from the back of the drawer. From the doorway, he said, "What are you doing? Leaving?" His laugh was short, sharp, ugly. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm not. You think you can just walk out? After everything I've done for you?" I zipped the suitcase. "After everything you've done to me." He stepped into the room, his voice rising for the first time in years. "You're throwing away a good life. You've never wanted for anything." I looked at him then, really looked. The man who had built an entire marriage on keeping me small enough to manage. And I said, "I've wanted for everything that mattered. And you made sure I couldn't have it." For a moment, he didn't speak. I could see the words he wanted to say flickering behind his eyes, but he swallowed them. When I rolled the suitcase past him, he didn't move to stop me. At the door, I turned once. "You feared my voice, Thomas. That's why you tried to silence it. But it's mine again, and you don't get to hear it anymore." I stepped outside into the cold air. The drive to the apartment was only 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing a border I'd been told my whole life didn't exist. Each mile was lighter than the last. When I parked, I carried my suitcase up the narrow stairs, my breath visible in the air, my key already in my hand. The moment I unlocked the door, the smell of baking bread from the bakery below drifted in. The apartment was small. A single living room, a kitchen just big enough for a table, a bedroom with a slanted ceiling. But it was quiet in a way that wasn't dangerous. I set the suitcase down, hung my scarf on the back of a chair, and stood for a long moment in the middle of the room. The silence here was different. It didn't press on me. It didn't demand anything. It was space, space I could fill with my own voice, my own choices. That first night, I made tea and drank it, sitting cross-legged on the floor by the window. Outside, snow began to fall, coating the street in a thin, glowing layer. I opened my notebook and wrote, without stopping, for hours. I didn't write about him. Not really. I wrote about me, the me who had been waiting all these years to speak. Later, I hung the scarf Eleanor gave me on the wall like a banner. I played music, loud, imperfect music, and let it fill every corner. When I went to bed, I thought I might lie awake, restless, but I slept deeply, without dreams. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a rhythm. Mornings at the bakery downstairs, afternoons at the library, evenings filled with meetings, classes, laughter. People began to know me as Margaret, not Thomas's wife. And every time someone said my name like that, I felt a small stitch of myself knit back into place. 2 months later, I ran into Thomas at the grocery store. We stood by the produce section, the hum of the refrigerators loud between us. "You look different," he said. "I am," I replied. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't talk about the future. We just parted ways, two people who had once shared a life but no longer shared a story. Walking away, I realized I felt no anger, no regret, only a steady, quiet certainty, because I'd finally learned the thing that had taken me 62 years to understand. The absence of bruises is not the presence of love, and a silenced life is no life at all.